We've discussed one aspect of the relation between Laruelle's work and that of Badiou, with this idea of the subject as being outside all philosophical predicates and outside all predicates, transcendental predicates, just as much as empirical predicates, and outside all philosophical calculation with those predicates. This led to a consideration of a difference. So that's a point where Laruelle and Badiou agree. There's a difference of appreciation on the sense of that transcendental fact in relation to the concept of finitude. Laruelle concludes that the universal predicates being infinite, man as subject, as absolute, is finite, and Badiou concludes that we must go looking for a different concept of the infinite, which he finds in Cohen's work, with an idea of a generic infinity. Another question, if that's the right word here, we'll see there's a problem with the word question. Another question that could come up is if man, ordinary man, or the human is outside, is a subject, yet outside predicates, then one is tempted to say that man is outside subject-predicate affirmations, at least in the ordinary sense of predicates. So we could ask the question, yes, okay, outside subject-predicate affirmations, also outside relational affirmations for Laruelle, but what about questions? Is the question form somehow more appropriate to man or to thinking? And that's something that Laruelle goes into in the next paragraph, and Badiou considered as well. First, just to give some sort of context to this parallelism and divergence that I've been finding between Laruelle and Badiou, I'd like to go back to what Badiou was doing in this time in the middle of the 80s. So we don't see much trace of that in terms of published works, except in Badiou's seminars, which have only recently been published in French. So in 1983-1984, Badiou was dealing in his seminar with the concept of the one, l'un, a concept that's important to Laruelle as well. In 1984-85, he was dealing with the concept of the infinite as diversely theorized in Aristotle, Spinoza, and Hegel. In 1985-1986, back to the one and to the question of mathematization in relation to philosophy. So that was 1985-1986, Parmenides. And 1986-1987, which I think is a sort of first culmination of that work, and a culmination of the work that he was doing in another seminar that was leading up to being an event being published in 1988. And the seminar on Heidegger, I think, is one of Badiou's best works. It's one of the best works that I've ever read on on Heidegger's philosophy, on a critique of Heidegger's philosophy, on establishing, despite all the problems and obstacles that Heidegger throws up against a dialogue on equal terms between him and another thinker, Badiou achieves the amazing exploit of speaking at the same level of generality and extension and depth as Heidegger, and speaking to Heidegger on equal terms, and making what seem like monological affirmations open to dialogical exploration and discussion. So that's what Badiou was doing during the time that Laruelle had made his break with the principle of minority, was getting to a point which he claims is no longer transitional in its exposition, but as we see later, Laruelle does go on to more complete, more didactic explications of his thought, as in principles of non-philosophy. So his work is in fact transitional, whether he likes to present it as that or not. Anyhow, Laruelle was going through his own breakthrough and transition in this period, and it's not surprising to find commonalities, at least in terms of the subjects and themes of reflection, even if their conclusions and the manner of thought are widely different. Although, as I have already remarked, there are some important points of convergence. On page 9 of A Biography of Ordinary Man, Laruelle begins, he ends one paragraph from page 8, and the first new paragraph on page 9 begins, ordinary man is devoid of qualities or attributes through a completely positive sufficiency. So we've already noted that sufficiency is connotated positively in this book, where in later books where Laruelle has set up or transitioned to his notion of non-philosophy, sufficiency takes on a negative connotation as the principle of philosophical sufficiency. So here, not only is it given is sufficiency given a positive connotation, but it is also given positivity as an attribute. So a completely positive sufficiency. This will come up in a discussion of this paragraph. We've already seen the role of positivity for Laruelle as an antidote, one could say, but he's going to criticize the notion of antidote later on, but as a way of remaining separate from, while allowing to play its course, the dissolution and negativity that is the overriding movement of the meta research program of the West in its final form, which is based on anthropological difference instead of anthropological parallelism. So there's so much dissolution that we may be at a loss for positivity, And this is one of the arguments that Laruelle finds for his leap into the absolute. It's a leap into positivity as well. Ordinary man lacks nothing, not even philosophy. So this is, amongst other things, with the notion of positivity as well. This is a callback to Deleuze and Guattari, where they say that desire lacks nothing, as opposed to the various thoughts of the lack, including Lacan, that have preceded. So Laruelle takes up the notion of multiplicities and minorities, and agrees with Deleuze, although he doesn't quote Deleuze, that they lack nothing insofar as they are multiplicities, insofar as they are individuals are minorities, they lack nothing. So being devoid of predicates is not the same as, for ordinary man, or ordinary humans, as being devoid of essence. Man, this is man as he takes his essence from himself, or more precisely, immediately from his essence, without it having been an attribute beforehand. So man takes his essence from his essence. I wonder if take is the right word there. It's a strange word, taking something by being it. So, il tient son essence de lui-même. He holds, or he has, or because there's the de, from, you could say he derives, he takes from, but he we've seen this idea of tenir, maintenir, holding his essence. He holds his essence from its essence. This is a difficultly acceptable, grammatically speaking, expression that goes back to what we saw on page, on what page? When we're talking about the self-inherence. On page 8 at the bottom. The essence of man remains in the one that is in the inherence, or inherence, that is non-positional of itself, or non-positional itself. So we said that made it that man is not inherent in a non-positional way. That's a good way of saying it, except grammar, linguistic grammar gets in our way, and that makes it inherent a predicate. And we have a subject predicate form, and thus separation. So the correct way of saying it from a conceptual point of view is man is self-inherence, and that we've got a noun, and that is an absolute form if we say man is self-inherence, or the self-inherence is an absolute form. So it's the same thing here. He takes his essence from his essence, without the essence having been a predicate beforehand. So he doesn't take his essence from history, biology, state, philosophy. And, important, back to the positivity idea, there is no pejorative or minorative connotation to saying ordinary or minorities. They're conceptually speaking, maybe that's the thing. Here, before we said there was for the use of parentheses in Laruelle, they were to mark a decoupling of linguistic grammar and transcendental grammar. Here we have a similar thing in terms of linguistic semantics and transcendental semantics. So in ordinary semantics, ordinary, and even more so minorities, minoritarian, and so on, as we see in the word, are minorative terms semantically. But in Laruelle's transcendental reconstruction of language, they're purely positive terms. I am a sufficient solitude, too far below solipsism to have to extricate myself from it. So we have sufficient there in the positive connotation. Solitude alludes to many things. Maybe if we stick to just immanent references, the solitude goes back to the one, which is minorities. So it's too far below solipsism. So below here is, we'll see later on that he tries to get away, as Deleuze does, from these vertical hierarchies. So below may have connotations that he may want to avoid. So the sense of below there is in a sense of underdetermination. It's a solitude under determined in relation to the binary of solitude and collectivity. So it's not solipsism. I am out of the question. So here we come to what I was talking about in the beginning. I am out of the question. And this is our second paragraph. We have the big experience of Laruelle's parentheses. Once again, I underline that I've never seen anybody explain any of these terms with the parentheses in them. And I've neither given a general interpretation nor an interpretation of the particular instances that may come up. So my hypothesis for a general explanation, although we shall see if it holds for all the cases in the book, but my hypothesis is that the parentheses are there when, especially when they're around a preposition, when linguistic grammar requires the presence of the preposition, but a thought or transcendental grammar requires that we think without, requires the absence of this preposition. So I am out of the question. Unfortunately, we have, as well as this dissonance, or this cognitive dissonance or conceptual dissonance between empirical linguistic grammar and transcendental grammar, we have a difference between English and French. In French, out of the question, hors de question. That means it cannot be called into question. So it accepts the game the language game, if you want, of questions, and just says there are these points within the language game of questions which cannot be put into question. And hors question, that's possible. We can, it's not normal, but we can leave out the de, the of in French, and it has a meaning. Hors jeu means outside the game, cannot be put into play. Hors question means it's not just something that's there with the other things that can be called into question, and this can't be. It's outside the very game of, or language game of questions, just as we said that man is outside the ordinary game of subject-predicate affirmations with philosophical or empirical predicates. Maybe there are other sorts of predicates, and we'll see that Laruelle has lots of predicates, but it's not only outside these ordinary affirmations, but man is also outside the very game or practice or field or region of questions. No question of man, no ontological primacy of the question of man. I do not find... Okay, and here is a very concise sentence. I do not find my essence in my existence or in my questions. I experience my subjective essence before these questions. So here he's taking on both Sartre and Heidegger. I do not find my essence in my existence. That is a callback to Sartre's claim in Existentialism is a humanism, that man's existence precedes his essence, which is both a provocative sentence in itself and conceptually, because there's a sort of thing, if man's essence existence precedes his essence, then his existence is itself an essence, so it must precede itself, and we get a sort of hall of mirrors effect that Laruelle will refer to just a little later. So man, or I, takes on, after having refuted the idea that the ordinary man is the cogito, or the I think, he expresses his thought in terms of I. He takes on the first person and says, I do not find my essence in my existence. So, goodbye to Sartre, or in my questions. So, this is an allusion to something that Heidegger takes on that Badiou takes on in Heidegger, the idea that somehow the essence of man, or the essence of thinking, is questioning, the errance of questioning. And Badiou is quite clear about this in the Heidegger seminar, that he rejects that whole image of thought. That thought is essentially questioning, because not only is there finding, but there's also the leaps and the conditions of thought that come before. There's also the axioms that come before and are not the subject or the object of a question, but are the condition for questions to be possible. So Laruelle, in this concise little sentence is posing an alternative to both Sartre and Heidegger. I am the beginning of my life and my thought. Beginning here can't be chronological. He's not dealing with reincarnation or some sort of Platonic reminiscence. It's a beginning in a transcendental sense, and dealing with the question of essence that is not an essence that is not derived from the conditions of existence, and it is a self-derived essence, a self-essencing essence. So in this way, I exclude the question and the mise en abîme from my essence. So I think he's got two things, the question and the mise en abîme. So I think he's referring back to the two things that he refers to just before, Sartre and Heidegger. So the question, I exclude the question, I exclude Heidegger's image of thought, and the mise en abîme, I exclude Sartre's man's existence precedes his essence, because that would produce a mise en abîme. And both are forms of dissolution. If the question is the be-all and end-all of thought, it's a foundation that is in itself a dissolution. So Laruelle is following his idea that where perhaps this is the epoch where it must come to the fore, where in the paradigm that after dissolution poses the positivities. And because it poses the positivities, it needs to put a stop as well, not just to the interrogatory dissolution, but to the mise en abîme of the priority of existence to essence, which will create an infinite regress as well. My essence is defined by characteristics that are absolutely original, primitive, internal. That's the thing we saw about it's so internal that it's self-inherent, and without equivalence in the world, through the one or the unreflective. Okay, here we're getting the idea that with his new theoretical language, he still has to use many of the old terms. He will coin expressions and so on. And it's the new theoretical language that is, by semantic trickle-down effects, giving content to the words that are necessary to describe the characteristics of ordinary man, and saying these words are, these meanings, these new meanings of these words are self-inherent, absolute, and have no real equivalent in the world. There's deductive, at least deductive, and empirical disconnect. So they're incommensurable. Okay, so I'm defined through the one or the unreflective. So through the one we've already seen. The one is the absolute, is the positivity outside the play of predicates in the world, and it unreflective. This is something very very strange that comes up in Deleuze as well. The problem is to get away from reflection. Both are, in the ordinary sense, very philosophically reflexive authors. So there's something provocative of thought, in this claim to unreflectiveness. So I think the unreflectiveness goes with the positivity and the selfinherence. If it's unreflective, it means you don't have this mise en abîme, for example, of mirrors of mirrors of mirrors. There's a cut, as Zizek would say, a cut. Why can't cuts be in all sorts of directions? Anyhow, there's a cut. It's a positivity, an absolute. And there is not even the tiniest gap within the positivity to create a reflectiveness. There's not even the tiniest gap between itself and its inherence, itself and its essence, its self-essencing, self-inherence. So that's the unreflective. There is a question of being, but the one is out of the question. So being Heidegger's favorite concept, but that he made a case for considering a sort of underlying question resonating even in its very forgottenness through the history of the West. Yes, there's a question there for being, and that's because the concept and the question are within the world. But the one, in Laruelle's sense of the one, is outside of all questions. So it is the structures of this ordinary man that he's going to describe, individual structures. So this is his sense of the individual outside the world of authorities and minorities. So it's not chaos. It's got structures, but structures of a different sort, transcendental structures, and these structures are invisible to the light of reason or intelligence. So we've already talked about this invisibility between phenomena in different paradigms. Man is a concept within the new paradigm. Ordinary man, the ordinary human, is a concept for phenomenal content, Laruelle calls it, that is invisible within the Greco-unitary paradigm. And because it's invisible to the light of the Greco-unitary paradigm, Laruelle is willing to go so far as to say it's invisible to the light of reason or intelligence, with a capital letter in each case, capital R, capital I. So he's referring to these faculties as they are defined within the Greco-unitary paradigm, and so they are disqualified epistemologically, and they're incapable of seeing or even making visible ordinary man and the various other characteristics, structures, and phenomenal contents that with ordinary man. Okay, these structures of the ordinary man are not ideal essences that's still within the world, but are finite, inalienable, and thus indisputable lived experiences. Okay, finite we've already seen. That's because they're not characteristics and structures describable by the philosophical calculus of universal predicates. Inalienable, so maybe another sense of finite is possible. Inalienable, for we've already discussed. The thought at that time in French critical circles was to reject the idea of alienation, and we saw that there were two ways of rejecting it. Either we say that man has no essence, so no alienation is possible, or we say that, as Laruelle does, because the other way was the way of, for example, Lyotard, as Laruelle does, yes, anthropological man has no essence, so I agree, no alienation is possible, and as well, man as the one of the core concepts of the new paradigm has an essence that is, as we said, there's not the slightest little gap between ordinary man and his or her essence. They're the same thing. So man cannot be alienated, because if, and it's an impossible thing to think, but if man could be alienated from his essence, he would no longer be man, so he wouldn't have been alienated from it. So it's inalienable. And so these experiences are indisputable. This is problematic. We've said up to this point that Laruelle has been methodologically impeccable in his description of his own heuristic procedure of thought, but we've also said that he's put in markers of authority, although he has transvalued these markers. So I suppose we're meant to read indisputable in a transvalued sense, but it just sort of sticks out there. Why would it be indisputable? Is he saying that his thought is indisputable? He himself is not going to say the same things later in Tetralogos. He does. He always claims that it's the same thing as 5 waves or whatever, but it's just one thought. But it's not true. He changes on lots of things. So is he disputing with himself when he's in transition? That would disputing with himself be reflection and thus bad? Does he just sort of mutate from wave to wave or from work to work with no reflection and no self-dispute allowed? That's a possibility, but psychologically, so I'm using empirical reasoning here, it sounds unlikely. Laruelle has his reasons. This book, despite the sort of dogmatic veneer, does have lots of arguments and reasoning. And so the disputation is an underlying current. So if it's indisputable, it's untestable. And we said that Laruelle's thought as transcendental science. Science means testability, and Laruelle agrees with that idea. If we go back to page 7, at the near the bottom of the paragraph that ends on this page, he says, if the essence of man is not a difference, something like an undecidable decision, it is the radical subject of an ordeal. So I didn't comment on it at the time, but the word for ordeal that is translated as ordeal there is épreuve. The earlier on they translated as test. On page 4 I said that faire l'épreuve, on page 4 I've put test there, faire l'épreuve, they translate as test, as a verb. Here they've got l'épreuve and they translate it as ordeal. Well, it's the subject of an ordeal. That's a strong way of saying a test. And this pure positivity, which is outside the affirmative universal predicates, which is outside the question, is still the subject and the object of science, of Laruelle's transcendental science, and is still the subject of an ordeal, an experimental ordeal, like we say, experimentum crucis, a crucial experiment, of crucial experiments. Crucial is a sort of ordeal type experiments. So the subject is a radical subject of a test. I'm supposing there's not just one test, it's in the sense of a generalizing use of the indefinite article. So it's not indisputable, both for conceptual reasons and for the boring empirical reason that Laruelle changes his mind on the experiences of man later on. So individual structures of the essence of man are describable outside all anthropological prejudice. Does he really say that? Yes, describable outside all anthropological prejudice. Okay, the anthropological prejudice, in fact, it's all, insofar as it's anthropological, it's all prejudice. It's all ideology, it's all prejudice, it's all the world of authorities and minorities. Okay, these individual or finite determinations grant man not just possibility, but a specific and determined reality. Once again, I'm going to say I don't like the connotation of determined, ed, and just as we translate indéterminé most of the time with Laruelle as indeterminate, ate, we would be well advised to translate déterminé as determinate, ate again, specific and determinate. That goes together for me. Determined, when we're saying that it doesn't draw its essence from anything, it's totally uninfluenced by the world. It would seem to be better to say determinate than determined. Okay, these individual finite determinations render possible a science of the human's relations to the world, history, language, and so on, not the ones hallucinated by the social sciences. Finally, he gets to a definition of his title. This is the meaning of this biography of ordinary man. So, definition: a rigorous description of the most general experiences that govern the relation of individuals as such to history, state, economy, language. Okay, so we've got the rigorous language, the rigorous description against the carelessness of philosophy. And the rigor is also human rigor, so against the inhumane approach of philosophy. Okay, here he says something very strange at the beginning of the next paragraph, which is the first paragraph on page 10. The text of this science is thus no longer the cogito and its membra dissecta. Okay, it, that is to say the text, is the irreducible individual kernel that must be extracted from the cogito, in which it is still enclosed and concealed. So there's something good about the cogito, and it just doesn't go far enough, and the cogito is the nut in its shell, and the text of Laruelle science is the irreducible individual kernel. So even the cogito we saw can be reduced and is reduced by the deconstructive, dissolutive evolution of the human sciences, but the individual as real, as absolute, is irreducible. There's no reduction that is going to be possible here. So it's outside the game of reductions, which is a game of semantic reduction, which is finding the universal predicates that describe the other predicates that we may have stopped at premature stages in the history of knowledge, and that now we're capable of using the language, whether it's neurological or quantum or materialist in some other way. We now have, or psychoanalytical, why not? We now have the language of fundamental predicates to which everything else can be reduced either explicitly by definitions or at least notionally. Even if we don't have a one-to-one correspondence, we know that these other predicates are to be disappeared in the final analysis. We no longer conceive of this extraction as a philosophical operation because it is actually an immediate given. So this is the thing. He's inside the cogito, taking out the core, which is the real individual, But he's saying that's not just one more reduction. The philosophical operation is reduction. But extraction for Laruelle is something else. It's outside that logic of reduction, because it gives us an immediate given, which we here merely render perceptible. So this given was invisible in the old paradigm and is now visible or rendered perceptible in the new paradigm. So it's not a given in the sense that it's our experience from whenever, from any epoch, from any country, or so on, any class. We've got this experience that we're aware of, and any theory must be able to explain it. And it just so happens that no theory has been able to explain this given, this experiential given, because they've been determined by Greco-unitary thought. No, the given is a given only once we have the new paradigm to visibilize it as given. So it was always there, so it was given in that sense, but not it's an unexperienced experiential given before, or it's experienced but we're not aware of. This is the notion of render perceptible. In French it's sensibiliser, which means both make sensible in the sense of available to the senses, and also make aware. In a sense, we could apply the notion of knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. Knowledge by description is a knowledge by means of universal predicates. That's theoretical knowledge. Knowledge by acquaintance is when you're acquainted with, you've encountered something that is given to you in your becoming acquainted with, in your acquaintancing. So you are acquainted with, you are aware of, without necessarily being able to apply a set one or a set of universal predicates. So that's where we're getting new acquaintances from the new paradigm. The foundation of a science of man entails first of all creating a non-philosophical affect, rendering perceptible the immediate givens. Okay, so we're creating an affect. There he says the word, we're creating. It's a given. It's an immediate given, but the being affected, so being aware of or perceiving this immediate experience, that is a non-philosophical affect which is created. Okay, here we notice the adjective non-philosophical. As I said before, this is a transitional work, despite him saying that the minority principle was the transitional work and this is the definitive work. This is a transitional work. He doesn't have his full-on vocabulary for the second wave set up, so he doesn't talk about non-philosophy except in a pejorative way, but he talks about non-philosophical in whatever the opposite of pejorative is, in a ameliorative way. So we're talking about a finite transcendental experience in man. So all these experiences, they're givens, but they're transcendental. So they're intrinsically, self-inherently conceptual at the same time as they're phenomenal and experiential. So we have to take this step of the creation of a non-philosophical affect, otherwise we're stuck in unitary anthropology. So even though the immediate givens don't make up all of our relation with the universal predicates and their unity, they are the rock that allows the scientific description of his relations. They're the rock, they're the foundation. They're a dispersive, multiplicitous rock, but they're the rock, they're the base. The phenomenal givens of this science, and its only text, is the one. Here we get the word text again. And it's difficult to justify, except as perhaps a callback to Derrida, because here we have a text which is an hors text, where Derrida is famous for saying that there's nothing hors text, there's nothing outside the text. Laruelle has constructed this concept, which is both text and non-text at the same time. And so that's why he could say the complete text of the science of man is double, or dual. Dual. Here we have Laruelle's play with the morphology of words, because he needs more words than the language has. And so he has to take one word and double it by playing on the fact that AL and EL are both pretty familiar and useful suffixes. And that's enough. I mean, he's not really composing totally outlandish and frightening words. He's just doing a little tinkering with the suffixes, with the vowels, one at a time. So that's enough. I mean, he does need more words than the language has. He needs not just transformed conceptual syntax, not just transformed semantics. He needs transformed morphemes to get across the new paradigm. So he goes on to say, this is not strictly speaking a humanity principle, whose statue we would try to erect beside or beyond the power principle. Okay, here he's referencing himself, his book at the end of the 70s, just before the minority principle, was Beyond the Power Principle. So he's criticizing himself. So he's not Mr. Indisputable in his own eyes. He's criticizing that whole approach of going beyond. He'll say something about that a little later. And that whole approach that, in a way, he was still guilty of in the minority principle, as we see in the title. He's criticizing that approach of posing principles. It's not a principle that's a sort of universal construct from within the predicates of the world, and it's still within the cave. By composing a new principle, the humanity principle, that's why it's a biography of ordinary man and not the ordinary principle or the humanity principle. That will still be maybe a very refined and sublimated variant, but it would still be within the anthropological paradigm. So we're talking about the real essence of man before all the differences that philosophers want us to believe in. And ordinary man is not an antidote to superior man. It's not an antidote because antidotes are within the world. I talked about the refusal of antidotes before. And it's against this heroic and agonistic conception of man that he is writing this book. And so the bad names are what in the fashionable thought are called difference, différance, and the different. So reference to Lyotard as well.